My name is Quinn Delaney. I am 38 years old, a forensic linguist who speaks 9 languages fluently. I never thought those languages would become my weapon, not against foreign criminals or rogue agents, but against my own family. The room was silent that morning, thick with tension and the faint hum of the overhead lights. I stood at the center of a hearing chamber that smelled of polished wood and fear, staring straight at the man who had once been my protector, and now my adversary, my father Harold Delaney. He used to tell me that learning languages was a waste of time, that real power came from numbers, contracts, and wealth. I could still hear his voice echoing in my memory. 9 languages won't save your inheritance, my father told me. He said it with that cold, dismissive tone that could cut deeper than any blade. But when I used all 9 to unravel every offshore contract at the hearing, the room froze, including him. My name is Quinn Delaney. The tension was so thick that every small sound, a pen scratching, a chair creaking, felt like thunder. I laid out the documents one by one, each page, marked with signatures, hidden clauses, and multilingual misdirections, designed to siphon my mother's trust fund into shadows. I translated each passage in its native language, my voice steady, my heart pounding like war drums beneath my ribs. English, then French, then Italian. Each language peeled away a layer of deceit, exposing what they tried so hard to bury. When I shifted to Japanese, the room stirred. A few auditors leaned forward, realizing the depth of the scheme. My father's eyes flickered just once, but I caught it. He sat rigid, hands gripping the armrest of his leather chair, jaw tight, as if my words were bullets. For years, he had mocked me. He believed strength was about silence, about controlling the narrative, but not today. I remember looking up at the panel of judges, their faces unreadable, but their silence heavy with shock. Beside them, the family lawyer Chaz Irving wiped sweat from his brow. He had underestimated me, thinking I was just the quiet daughter with a head full of useless words. But every word I had learned was a key. And today, I unlocked every door they tried to slam in my face. I could feel the shift in the room when I switched to German, a language my father once claimed was too harsh for a young girl to bother with. His gaze faltered. The more I spoke, the more his world crumbled piece by piece like glass under pressure. A man who had always commanded respect now sat silent, powerless, and pale. At that moment, I realized I wasn't just fighting for money or inheritance. I was fighting for my mother's name, for the years of neglect and betrayal hidden behind polite family dinners. I was fighting for myself. And I was winning. The chairwoman of the panel leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Continue, Ms. Delaney." I nodded, my fingers brushing over the final set of contracts. The last page was in Spanish, full of deliberately confusing legal jargon, but I broke it down line by line, exposing the trap Chaz and Miles had set. Every detail I revealed was like a knife slicing through the facade my father built. I glanced at him once more, searching for any sign of remorse, but found none. His face was stone, but his knuckles had turned white. The room held its breath as I concluded. In every language, every document tells the same story, a story of theft, deception, and betrayal. And it all leads here. I placed my hand on the final document, the one bearing my father's signature. For the first time in my life, he didn't look like the man I once admired. He looked small. Silence flooded the room, pressing against every wall. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of reckoning. I let the moment stretch, holding my ground. My name is Quinn Delaney, and today they all knew it. 6 months ago, I would never have imagined standing in that hearing room. Back then, I still believed family was a safe harbor. My world was smaller, quieter, painted with trust I hadn't questioned. I thought my father's stern demeanor was just his way of protecting us, of keeping control after my mother died. I thought Miles, my older brother, was careless, but not cruel. I was wrong. The first crack appeared like an innocent mistake. An email in French riddled with grammatical errors landed in my inbox by accident. I almost deleted it, but something about it gnawed at me. I read it again, slowly, tracing every clumsy sentence. It wasn't just bad French, it was deliberate misdirection legal terminology twisted to hide something. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night, a single lamp casting long shadows across my notebook. I translated every line, whispering the words under my breath. As I worked, I felt an unease growing in my chest, like I was unraveling a secret that was never meant to be found. The email mentioned a company I had never heard of, registered in Luxembourg, connected to a trust fund, my mother's trust fund. My pulse quickened. I knew that trust. It was the one thing my mother left me, the one thread tying me to her memory. But according to this email, the trust was being dismantled, piece by piece, hidden through layers of shell corporations and foreign accounts. I confronted Miles the next day casually, like I was just curious. He laughed. He told me to stop digging into things I couldn't understand, that languages don't mean anything in the real world of finance. His exact words still burn in my mind. 9 languages won't help you when the contracts are written by sharks. I didn't argue. I never argued with Miles when he was in that mood. Instead, I watched him. I listened. That's what I do best, listen. And I started collecting pieces: a stray invoice in Italian, a letter from a Swiss bank, a legal memo in German. They thought using multiple languages would keep me blind, but it only made me sharper. I knew I had to move quietly. My father has friends, powerful friends, who don't take kindly to family disputes. But each time I uncovered another lie, another document, my resolve hardened. I wasn't just chasing money. I was chasing the truth. There was one moment I can't forget. Late one night, buried under a pile of papers, I found a clause in Spanish that explicitly transferred the majority of the trust assets to a shell company signed by my father. I stared at his name for a long time, my heart aching. I wanted to believe there was some explanation, something that would make sense. But the truth was staring back at me in black ink. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, the papers spread out like a battlefield, my mind replaying every cold comment my father had ever made. 9. Languages won't save your inheritance, he said once, half joking, half serious. He was right about one thing. Languages alone wouldn't save me. But the way I use them would. The next day, I called Evelyn Park, my old friend, who now worked as an investigator for the SEC. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but I told her enough to make her say, "Quinn, this isn't just a family dispute. This is fraud." Her voice was calm but urgent. That was the moment I knew I couldn't turn back. And now, here I am, standing in front of a room full of powerful people using every language I know to tell the story they tried to bury. When I laid the final document on the table, one of the lawyers whispered under his breath, "Impossible." But it wasn't impossible. It was the truth spoken in 9 voices, and for the first time, they all had to listen. I was born into a house where silence carried more weight than words. My father, Harold Delaney, was a retired military officer who believed discipline was the only language worth speaking. He moved through life like a man carved from stone, each movement precise, each word measured. My mother, on the other hand, was the opposite. She filled every corner of our home with warmth, music, and books. Her favorite thing was to sit in the living room by the window, reading novels in a soft melodic voice that made even the harshest days feel gentle. From a young age, I found refuge in her voice. She believed languages were bridges to understanding the world and other people. When I was 10, she handed me an old cassette tape she had bought at a yard sale. It was a beginner's course in Italian, scratched and worn, but to me it was a treasure. I remember holding it in my small hands as if it were a key to another universe. That night, while my father watched the evening news with the volume high, I slipped on the oversized headphones and whispered Italian phrases to myself. Buongiorno, grazie, arrivederci. Each word felt like a seed planted in my mind waiting to grow. My mother encouraged me every step of the way. She would leave sticky notes on the refrigerator with phrases in Italian or French and smile when I got them right. Sometimes she would read me poems in Spanish, rolling the words across her tongue like music. I would mimic her, trying to capture the rhythm and tone. For me, learning languages was like collecting colors for a painting I wanted to finish someday. But my father never understood. "Languages won't help you survive," he said once, his voice hard and flat. He stood in the doorway watching me practice with my cassette player. "Real strength is knowing how to act, not how to talk." I remember freezing, my hands trembling over the stop button. He shook his head and walked away, leaving a shadow of disappointment behind him. That was his way, never shouting, but letting silence say what he wouldn't. I grew up walking between two worlds, the bright melodic one my mother created, and the cold steel one my father demanded. At school, I buried myself in foreign language clubs, collecting dictionaries and grammar books like other kids collected baseball cards. At night, when the house was quiet, I would sneak into the kitchen, put on my headphones, and practice the sounds of other countries, other lives. By the time I turned 15, I could hold conversations in Italian and French. My mother would laugh softly and call me her little traveler, even though I had never left the country. But my father only looked at me with that same stoic gaze, as if all my accomplishments were just trivial games. He would say things like, "Words are wind, Quinn. They won't stop the storm when it comes." His words stung, but I kept learning anyway. Looking back now, I realize that every language I mastered was an act of quiet defiance. It was my way of carving out an identity in a house where I often felt invisible. My mother was my secret ally, slipping me books in German French movies with subtitles and old Spanish records. She gave me permission to dream of a bigger world, even when my father thought dreams were a waste of time. I remember one evening when my father caught me practicing Japanese calligraphy at the kitchen table. He stood there for a long moment, his arms crossed, watching the brush strokes form delicate characters on the page. Finally, he said, "You think this will make you strong? It won't. The world doesn't care how many ways you can say hello." His tone was not angry, just final, like a door closing. But I looked up at him, my hands steady, and said, "Maybe not, but it makes me feel alive." That was the first time I spoke back to him. He didn't reply, just walked away, leaving me alone with my brush and ink. In that silence, I realized something important. I wasn't learning these languages for him. I was learning them for me. Those years built the foundation for the person I became. Every new phrase, every carefully pronounced word was a reminder that the world was bigger than our house, bigger than my father's narrow vision. My mother once told me, "Languages are windows, Quinn, and one day you'll see how far they can open." At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. Now I do. My mother's death marked the first time our house truly fell silent. She had been sick for years, her body fading while her spirit tried to remain bright. I was 17 when she passed away. I remember the morning vividly, the pale sunlight slipping through the blinds, the stillness in her room, and the coldness of her hand when I touched it. My father stood at the foot of her bed, his face expressionless, as if his years in the military had trained him to shut down every human emotion. Miles, my older brother, stood beside him, shifting uncomfortably, not knowing what to say. The funeral was quiet, just like everything else in our family. I remember standing by her grave, listening to the wind, waiting for someone to say something meaningful. My father gave a speech brief and clipped more like a report than a farewell. He ended it with a line that still haunts me to this day. "Do not let your imagination waste your mother's estate. Cora Wynn." I remember those words hitting me like a slap. Imagination was what she'd given me through music, books, and languages, and now he was telling me not to waste her memory. After her death, the house felt colder than ever. My father threw himself into managing the trust fund she left behind. It was sizable enough to ensure we'd never have to worry about money, but he treated it like a battlefield. Miles followed his lead, learning everything about investment stocks and legal structures. I was left on the sidelines, the dreamer as they called me. For a while I didn't care. I was lost in grief, clinging to the books and tapes my mother left me. Her handwriting was still on the margins of her old novels. Her perfume lingered on a scarf I kept hidden in my dresser. But then I started noticing things. Papers I wasn't allowed to see. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. My father would meet with lawyers in hushed tones, the words trust and assets floating through the air like smoke. Miles tried to reassure me, saying things like, "Dad knows what he's doing. You don't need to worry about the money." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I asked a question, I was met with silence or vague answers. It was as if they believed I was too fragile or too naive to understand. One evening, I overheard my father on the phone. He was speaking in clipped phrases, talking about moving funds overseas, about protection and liabilities. He didn't know I was listening from the hallway, my heart pounding. I didn't understand everything, but I understood enough to feel the weight of betrayal. The trust fund wasn't just money. It was my mother's legacy, the culmination of her hard work and love. She had once told me she wanted that fund to support the dreams I dared to pursue. "It's your safety net," she had said with a smile, "so you can fly without fear of falling." But now that safety net was in the hands of a man who didn't believe in dreams. I tried to speak to my father about it, but he dismissed me with a wave of his hand. "You focus on your languages, Quinn. Leave the real work to us." The words stung, but I stayed quiet. At the time, I still believed he was doing what was best for us, even if his methods were harsh. Looking back, I realized that was the first betrayal. Not the contracts or the offshore accounts, but the way he shut me out. The way he treated me like a child when I was already old enough to understand the cost of silence. Miles wasn't much better. He would tease me saying, "You can say thank you in 9 languages, but can you read a balance sheet?" I laughed it off back then, but deep down, I felt the crack forming. It was subtle at first, just a small gap between us, but over time it grew into a canyon. My mother's absence left a hole no amount of money could fill. And as I watched my father and brother guard her trust, like it was a weapon, I made a promise to myself. I would learn every language, every code, every hidden meaning they thought I couldn't understand. Because one day, I would need those tools. I just didn't know how soon that day would come. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that blends into the rest of the week until I saw the email. I had been going through my personal inbox deleting newsletters and spam when one message caught my eye. It wasn't addressed to me, not exactly, but to a shared family account that I rarely checked. The subject line was in French, but the syntax was sloppy, almost as if someone had run it through an automated translator. Curious, I clicked it open. What I found made my stomach tighten. It was a thread between Miles and a lawyer named Chaz Irving, a name I had never heard before. The tone was casual, careless, but buried within the poorly written French were phrases that screamed of something more sinister. Phrases like transfer des actifs and société écran, which meant asset transfer and shell company. I read it once, then twice, my pulse quickening as I translated line by line. The email outlined a plan to move funds from my mother's trust into a company registered in Luxembourg, a company I didn't know existed. There were mentions of accounts in Singapore and Switzerland and instructions to obscure the paper trail through multiple intermediaries. The language was messy, but the intent was crystal clear. They were hiding something. My hands trembled as I printed the email, each page sliding out of the printer with a sound that felt too loud for the room. I laid them out on the kitchen table like puzzle pieces, highlighting every crucial phrase. It was hard to believe Miles could be part of this. He might be arrogant and dismissive, but I never thought he would cross this line. And then I saw my father's name. It wasn't in the email body, but in the attached document, a contract titled Alto Trust Agreement. My breath caught in my throat. The document was partially in German, partially in English, but I understood it well enough. It referenced a transfer of 40% of the trust's holdings to an offshore entity. At the bottom of the page, in bold, unmistakable ink, was Harold Delaney's signature. I sat frozen, staring at that signature. It looked exactly like the one on my birth certificate, the one on my school forms, the one he had scrawled across so many documents throughout my life. But seeing it here, on something that felt like a betrayal, was different. A mix of disbelief and anger flooded me. My first instinct was to call Miles to demand an explanation, but I stopped myself. If they were doing this behind my back, they wouldn't just confess because I asked. I had to be smart. I had to be quiet. I spent the next few hours digging deeper. I translated every word of the Alto Trust contract, cross-referencing terms and clauses in all 9 languages I knew, making sure I didn't miss a single detail. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. By late afternoon, I felt like my whole world had shifted. My mother's trust, the one she had built with love and care, was being dismantled piece by piece. And the 2 people I trusted most, my father and brother, were behind it. I couldn't decide what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the fact that they thought I was too naive to notice. I took a deep breath, folded the documents, and locked them in my desk drawer. My mind was spinning, but I forced myself to stay calm. Anger would only cloud my judgment. I needed a plan, and before I made my next move, I needed to look Miles in the eye. That evening, I drove to Miles's house under the pretense of a casual visit. He greeted me with his usual smirk, the kind that always made him look like he was one step ahead of everyone else. We sat in his sleek modern kitchen, the kind of place that looked like it had been ripped from a design magazine, all white marble and chrome. I started lightly. "I saw an email today," I said, my voice calm but deliberate. It was, interesting. French isn't exactly your strong suit, is it? He raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "What are you talking about, Quinn?" "An email from Chaz Irving's." I continued, watching his face for any sign of guilt. "About transferring assets. Something called the Alto Trust." For a split second, I saw his jaw tighten. Then he laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "You've been snooping again. Quinn, you and your 9 languages. You think knowing how to say money in 5 different ways makes you an expert?" I clenched my hands under the table but forced a smile. "I don't need to be an expert. I can read. And I know when something isn't right." He leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension. "Don't use your 9 languages to lecture me. This is grown-up business, not some academic game you can win with a dictionary. Dad and I know what we're doing. You don't." "Does Dad know he's risking Mom's legacy?" I asked quietly. That wiped the smirk off his face. For a moment, his expression hardened into something colder. "You really think you can challenge us?" He said, his voice low now. "You, the dreamer. The girl who thinks quoting Italian poems means she understands the world." I met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "If protecting Mom's trust makes me a dreamer, then yes, I'll challenge you." We stared at each other in silence, the tension between us thick. Then I stood, pulling a copy of the Alto Trust contract from my bag. "This isn't just grown-up business, Miles. It's fraud, and Dad's signature is all over it." His eyes widened. He snatched the document from my hand, scanning the page. "Where did you get this?" "It was attached to your email," I replied evenly. "Next time you might want to hide your tracks better." He tried to laugh it off, but I could see the panic flicker in his eyes. "You're blowing this out of proportion. This is just restructuring. Legal stuff you wouldn't understand." "Then explain it to me," I challenged. "Explain why Dad's name is on a document that transfers Mom's trust to a company in Luxembourg. Explain why there are hidden clauses in German that even you probably can't read." He didn't answer. Instead, he tossed the paper onto the counter and poured himself a drink. "You don't get it, Quinn. Dad wants this. He trusts me with it. He doesn't trust you. He never has." Those words stung, but they also gave me clarity. My father's signature wasn't an accident. He was in on this. And if I wanted to protect my mother's legacy, I would have to stand alone. I left Miles's house that night with a strange mix of anger and determination burning in my chest. The lines had been drawn, and I knew this was just the beginning. As I drove home, I repeated a single thought in my mind like a mantra. They think I'm powerless. They're wrong. The night after confronting Miles, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's signature on the Alto Trust contract, sharp and deliberate like a blade cutting through my mother's legacy. I sat at my desk, with a cup of cold coffee, the glow of my laptop screen, the only light in the room. I pulled out every document I had collected so far, printouts of the email contracts in multiple languages, and scattered notes I had scribbled in haste. I opened a new document and began creating a map, a digital web that would reveal the path of the money. I started with Luxembourg, tracing the shell company mentioned in the French email. From there, I found connections to 2 more companies, one in Panama and another in Singapore. Each link was buried beneath layers of legal jargon and complex structures designed to confuse anyone who dared to look. But I had an advantage: language. While most people would get lost in the tangle of French clauses, German disclaimers, and Spanish loopholes, I read them like open books. I translated line by line, highlighting every suspicious phrase. Transfer de propriété, Schutzklausel, transferencia sin autorización. Each phrase was a breadcrumb leading me closer to the truth. I built a flowchart on my wall using string and pins, like a detective from an old crime drama. At the top, I wrote Alto Trust in bold letters. Beneath it, I connected Luxembourg, Singapore, and Panama, each with arrows pointing to sub-entities and offshore accounts. Every time I added a new connection, the pattern grew clearer. This wasn't random. It was intentional, calculated, and executed by people who thought no one would look closely. The metadata on the German document was particularly revealing. I found hidden notes, timestamps, and digital fingerprints that linked back to an American IP address, one that I recognized. It belonged to a consulting firm my father had worked with years ago. My stomach dropped as I stared at the evidence. He wasn't just aware of these transfers. He had likely approved them. The sound of rain tapping against the window pulled me back to reality. I realized I had been at my desk for hours, my shoulders stiff and my eyes burning. I reached for my notebook, flipping through the pages of translations I had done over the years. Each language felt like a key unlocking a secret door. To test my theory, I called the Panama registry office, pretending to be a representative of a foreign investor. I switched from English to Spanish mid-sentence, and the clerk on the other end hesitated, then confirmed that the company I asked about, Solana Holdings, had been registered 6 months ago. The same time frame I saw on the Alto Trust document. The pieces were aligning faster than I expected. It was like pulling threads from a tightly woven cloth, each one revealing a hidden layer underneath. By the time dawn broke, I had connected the dots to form a nearly complete picture of what was happening. My mother's trust had been systematically drained, and I could trace the path of the money through 9 languages and 3 continents. I took a step back from the wall, staring at the web I had created. It felt overwhelming, but also empowering. For the first time, I realized that my father and Miles had underestimated me in the worst way. They thought my skills were useless, but every language I learned, every phrase I memorized, had led me here. Still, I knew I couldn't do this alone. The network of shell companies was too intricate, and I needed someone with legal authority to dig deeper. That was when I thought of Evelyn Park. Evelyn had been my closest friend in college. Back then, she was the sharp, ambitious girl who could dismantle a legal case before anyone else had even read the second page. After graduation, she joined the SEC and quickly rose through the ranks as an investigator specializing in financial fraud. We had lost touch over the years, but I knew if anyone could help me, it would be her. I called her that afternoon. "Evelyn, it's Quinn. Do you have time to talk?" There was a pause, then her voice softened. "Quinn Delaney, it's been forever. What's going on?" "It's about my mother's trust," I said carefully. I think my family is moving the funds illegally." I have documents, contracts. Slow down, she interrupted gently. Meet me tomorrow. Bring everything you have. The next day, I met her at a quiet cafe near her office. She looked exactly the same sharp suit, confident posture eyes that seemed to see straight through lies. I slid the folder of documents across the table, and she leafed through them silently. I watched her face as she read the French email, then the German clauses, and finally the Spanish contract. After a few minutes, she looked up, her brow furrowed. Quinn, this isn't just messy accounting, this is deliberate. Whoever did this knew exactly how to hide their tracks. These shell companies, Luxembourg, Panama, Singapore, they're classic offshore structures for asset diversion. My stomach tightened. Can you confirm if the funds have already been moved? She nodded slowly. I'll need to check with some contacts, but from what I see here, at least part of the trust has been siphoned off. 6 months ago, there was a big transfer, see this line. She pointed to a German clause I had highlighted. That means they moved a significant portion under the guise of strategic restructuring. It's a legal trick, but with your mother's name on these documents, this could get ugly. I swallowed hard. Miles and my father, they're behind this. Evelyn sighed. Quinn, if this involves your family, it's going to be brutal. Are you ready for that? These cases tear families apart. I don't care, I said firmly. This isn't just about money. It's about my mother's legacy. I can't let them erase her work. She studied me for a moment, then leaned back. All right, I'll help you. But you need to understand, once we start, there's no going back. I understand, I replied, my voice steady. She smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. I always knew those languages of yours would take you somewhere unexpected. Who knew they'd bring you here? I left the cafe with a strange mix of fear and determination. Evelyn had confirmed what I already suspected: part of the trust was already gone. My father and Miles weren't just hiding money. They were dismantling everything my mother left behind. And now, with Evelyn on my side, I was ready to fight back. As I walked through the crowded street, I thought about my father's words, how he dismissed my dreams, my skills, my entire identity. Languages won't save you, he had said, but maybe they would, maybe they already had. The deeper I dug into the documents, the clearer the pattern became. It was late at night and my desk was covered with papers, highlighters, and sticky notes in multiple languages. I had been translating for hours, moving from French to Spanish to German, each language revealing another layer of deceit. My hand shook slightly as I reached the final page of a contract marked Alto Trust. Annex the Third. The text was dense, written in complex German legal terminology, but I read it carefully, my mind racing with every word I deciphered. The clause was buried deep in the document, hidden under multiple references and cross articles. But once I translated it, the meaning was undeniable. Miles and Chaz had authorized a transfer of 42% of my mother's trust fund into a shell company registered in Panama. My stomach dropped as I read it again, my eyes scanning the line, Die Übertragung von Vermögenswerten ohne Zustimmung wird als interne Umstrukturierung behandelt. Translated, it meant, the transfer of assets without direct consent shall be classified as internal restructuring. I sat back in my chair, stunned. 42%. It wasn't just a number, it was years of my mother's hard work, savings, and sacrifices. I felt the weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest, but surprisingly, I didn't explode with anger. I stayed still, my mind shifting into a different gear. This wasn't the time for emotion. It was the time for strategy. I highlighted the clause in bright red and made notes in the margins linking it to previous findings. I realized that Miles and Chaz weren't acting alone. The document bore subtle markers of my father's involvement. His signature appeared on the authorizations, but there was also a pattern: contracts that passed through consulting firms he once worked with, all leading to the same destination: the depletion of the trust. I took a deep breath and opened my laptop. I created a master file containing every translation I had done so far, cross-referencing clauses in German, French, and Spanish. Each translation became a thread in a web. I was weaving a web that would eventually trap them in their own lies. I didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. I wanted justice, and I wanted to win without lowering myself to their level. I thought of my mother during those long hours of analysis. She always told me that words had power, that language could shape reality. Sitting there with 9 languages at my disposal, I understood what she meant. Every clause I translated, every loophole I exposed, felt like a victory for her memory. The shock was still there, simmering beneath my calm surface, but I channeled it into focus. I drafted a timeline of the transactions, aligning them with the dates on the contracts. The evidence was airtight. There was no way to deny what I had found. By the time dawn broke, I had a clear plan. I would compile everything into a single report and send it to Evelyn. But I also knew this wasn't enough. I needed to confront the people responsible in a way they couldn't ignore. If they wanted to play with legal structures, then I would use the law and my voice to bring everything into the light. I stood, stretched my aching back, and pinned the final translation to the wall. My office looked like the headquarters of a small investigative team. But it was just me, a woman they had underestimated. I smiled faintly at the irony. Miles once mocked me for knowing 9 languages. What's the point, he'd said. Now those languages were the reason I would win. A week later, I submitted my full report to Evelyn and the SEC. I didn't sleep much that week, and every day felt like I was walking on a tightrope. Evelyn called me one evening. "They want you to present your findings in a closed hearing," she said. "It's urgent. The evidence you gathered. It's shaking things up." The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. I arrived at the SEC building with my heart pounding, but my mind steady. I wore a simple navy suit, no makeup, no jewelry, just the quiet confidence that came from knowing I had the truth on my side. As I walked through the metal detectors and into the meeting room, I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Inside, a panel of 4 investigators sat behind a long table. Evelyn was there, her presence calm and reassuring. Miles wasn't present, but I could see Chaz Irving seated at the back, looking nervous and pale. My father's absence was deliberate. He wouldn't face me directly yet. One of the panel members, a woman with sharp eyes, gestured to the podium. "Ms. Delaney, please begin." I took a deep breath and placed my folder on the podium. I will not remain silent. When the truth is written in every word of these documents, I began, my voice clear and strong. For months, funds from my mother's trust have been transferred under false pretenses. I have translated every contract, every clause, and I am here to show you what they tried to hide. I started with the French contracts, reading the key sections aloud. Clause 4.3, Transfer des actifs, states that assets are moved for internal restructuring. But when translated and cross-checked, it becomes clear this clause was designed to bypass consent requirements. Then I moved to the Spanish document. In Section 7.2, Transferencia sin autorización, the language is deliberately vague to disguise the transfer of funds into offshore accounts. I have traced these accounts to Panama and Singapore, using official registries and linguistic markers to confirm authenticity. The panel listened intently as I shifted to German, the language that had revealed the most damning evidence. In Section 9, Fear of the Alto Trust Annex 3, it states, "Die Übertragung von Vermögenswerten ohne Zustimmung wird als interne Umstrukturierung behandelt." This translates to, "The transfer of assets without direct consent shall be classified as internal restructuring." I looked up, meeting each of their eyes. This single clause allowed 42% of the trust to vanish under a false narrative of strategic realignment. I spoke in all 9 languages during that presentation, weaving them together like threads of a tapestry. Each time I switched languages, I saw the panel members lean forward, realizing the depth of my investigation. Even Chaz shifted uncomfortably, his confidence unraveling with every word I spoke. At one point, one of the investigators, an older man with gray hair, interrupted. Ms. Delaney, are you saying these documents were deliberately written to exploit language barriers? Yes, I replied firmly. They assumed that no one would read across French, German, and Spanish with the precision of a native speaker. They relied on confusion and complexity to hide their tracks, but I see through it. The room was silent. I felt my mother's presence in that silence, as if she were standing behind me, urging me on. I turned the final page and said, "This is not just a financial scheme. It is a betrayal. My family's name is on these documents, but I will not allow my mother's legacy to be erased." The climax of the hearing came when I presented a single sheet of paper, the Alto Trust signature page. "This is my father's signature," I said quietly. "It is authentic, and it is tied to every offshore account I've traced." Evelyn stepped forward with her own evidence corroborating my findings. The panel began whispering among themselves, exchanging documents, their expressions tense. In that moment, I realized the power of what I had done. I hadn't raised my voice or made threats. I had simply spoken the truth in 9 languages and let the evidence speak louder than any argument. When I finished, the room stood still for a long time. Finally, the chairwoman nodded. "Thank you, Ms. Delaney. We will review these findings immediately. This changes everything." As I stepped away from the podium, I caught Chaz's eyes. He looked pale, his bravado gone. I walked past him without a word, knowing this was only the first step. The fallout came faster than I expected. The morning after the hearing, Miles showed up at my apartment uninvited. He slammed the door behind him, his face red, his jaw clenched. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and panic. I stood by the kitchen counter, my arms crossed, forcing myself to stay calm. I presented the truth, I said evenly. "The truth." He laughed bitterly. "You went behind our backs, aired family business to strangers, and now everything we built is falling apart. You've ruined us, Quinn." I felt a sting in my chest, but I didn't flinch. "I didn't ruin us. You did when you tried to hide what you were doing with Mom's trust." He stepped closer, his voice lowering into a dangerous growl. "You think you're better than me because you can read contracts in 9 languages. Newsflash, Quinn, knowing how to say betrayal in German doesn't make you a hero. It makes you a traitor to your own family." The word traitor cut deep, but I met his glare with steady eyes. Family doesn't steal from each other, Miles. Family doesn't turn our mother's legacy into a pile of offshore accounts. If standing up for her makes me a traitor, so be it. His breath came heavy. For a moment, I thought he might hit the counter in anger, but instead he just shook his head, muttering under his breath, "You'll regret this." Then he stormed out, leaving the door wide open behind him. Later that evening, I went to my father's house. I found him sitting in the living room, the TV off the room dim, except for a single lamp in the corner. He didn't look up when I entered. He just sat there, his hands folded, staring at the floor like he was trapped inside his own thoughts. "Dad," I said softly. Nothing, not a word. I walked closer, my voice firm now. "I know you signed those contracts. I've seen the documents. I know what you and Miles did." His eyes finally lifted, but the look in them was something I'd never seen before. It wasn't just anger, it was shame, raw and unfiltered. He didn't argue or defend himself. He just sat there silent, his jaw tight, as if the truth was a weight he couldn't carry. "Why, Dad?" My voice trembled despite my effort to sound strong. "Why would you do this to Mom's trust?" To me, he exhaled slowly but said nothing. His silence felt like a wall I couldn't break through. But I also knew this silence meant he couldn't deny it. For years, I had feared his disapproval, his judgment. Now I saw a man who was cornered, a man who finally realized his daughter wasn't someone he could control with a cold stare. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for him to say something, anything. When he didn't, I turned to leave. My voice was quiet but steady. "I'm not backing down, Dad. Not this time." I closed the door behind me, my heart heavy but resolute. 2 days later, an email arrived in my inbox. There was no subject line, no greeting, no signature. Just a single sentence written in his clipped military-like tone. "If I sign a confession, will you go public?" I read it once, then again, my hands trembling slightly over the keyboard. The words were simple, but their meaning was devastating. A confession meant he knew exactly what he had done. It wasn't a misunderstanding, a legal loophole, or a misplaced signature. It was deliberate. I stared at the screen, my chest tight. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to hear him say the words, "I'm sorry," but I knew better. My father wasn't the kind of man who apologized. This email wasn't about regret. It was about control. He was testing me, trying to see if I would hesitate. I leaned back in my chair, the memories of the hearing replaying in my mind. His name on the Alto Trust documents. His silence when I confronted him. His refusal to look me in the eye. I realized then that the man I had always tried to impress had built his life on shadows and secrets. I typed a reply, then deleted it. I started again, but every word felt wrong. Finally, I wrote a single line, "No." I didn't explain, didn't justify. I simply hit send. After that, I sat in silence, my mind buzzing. His email wasn't a question, it was a confession of its own kind. He knew that if I wanted to, I could destroy his reputation. He was asking for mercy, but he wasn't willing to give me the truth in return. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my apartment, replaying every conversation we had ever had about responsibility, honor, and family. I thought about my mother, about the way she believed in compassion, but also in doing what was right. I imagined what she would say if she were here now. By morning, I had made a decision. I wouldn't let his shame or fear dictate my next move. I had the evidence. I had the law on my side. And I had my voice 9 languages strong, each one ready to speak the truth. But deep down, a part of me still hurt. This wasn't just about contracts and money. It was about the man who raised me, the man I once thought was unshakable, now reduced to sending me an email with no subject, no apology, just desperation. I printed the email and placed it in the same folder as the Alto Trust documents. It felt symbolic, like the final piece of the puzzle. The truth was no longer something I had to chase. It was right here in black and white. My father was guilty, and he knew it. I sat down at my desk and opened a fresh page in my notebook. At the top, I wrote, "What comes next?" Because I knew this fight wasn't over. The confession was only the beginning of what needed to be done. The days following my father's email were a blur of whispers and sidelong glances. Even though the SEC hearings were behind closed doors, word had leaked someone always talks. By Monday morning, I could feel the ripple effect of my actions. Within the quiet halls of the legal offices I visited, people glanced at me like I had done something scandalous. To them, I wasn't just the daughter who uncovered financial fraud. I was the woman who dared to expose her own blood. Rumors spread like wildfire. I overheard a conversation outside the SEC cafeteria. "She's ruthless, turning on her family like that." Another voice whispered, "Or maybe she's just brave enough to do what no one else would." The divide was clear. Some admired me for standing up to corruption, while others branded me as cold-hearted. Evelyn, always straightforward, called me late one evening. "Quinn people are starting to ask questions," she said. "Some of them are saying you've gone too far." I sighed, staring at the mess of documents spread across my dining table. Too far, Evelyn. They stole 42% of my mother's trust. They signed fraudulent contracts and hid them under layers of legal deception. How is exposing that too far? There was a pause on the line. Then Evelyn asked the question that cut straight through me. "Are you planning to destroy your father completely?" I froze. The question lingered like smoke, filling every corner of my mind. "Destroy him," I repeated, my voice quieter now. "You know what I mean," she said. If this goes public, Harold Delaney's name will be ruined. He'll lose everything, his reputation, his standing. Are you ready to carry that on your conscience? I looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. My father's face flashed in my mind, his rigid posture, his unspoken pride, his cold silence, when he couldn't find the words to apologize. Did I want to ruin him? I don't want revenge, Evelyn, I finally said. But I can't protect him, not when he chose this path. He signed those documents. He made those decisions. I can't erase that. Evelyn sighed, her tone softening. I understand. I just want you to know what's coming. People will talk and some will twist the truth. You need to stay focused. I've been focused my whole life, I replied. This is no different. Still that night, I couldn't shake her words. Was I ruthless? Was I doing this to hurt him? Or was I simply fighting for what was right? I thought of my mother's gentle voice, the way she always taught me that truth matters even when it hurts. That gave me strength. By Wednesday, internal emails circulated among SEC staff about a second hearing. Harold Delaney had been requested to appear this time to address the evidence directly. I knew it would be brutal. I also knew I had to be there no matter what it cost me emotionally. The second hearing felt heavier than the first. The room was filled with the same panel members, but the atmosphere was more charged, more expectant. I sat at the far side of the table, my folder of documents neatly stacked before me. Evelyn sat beside me, her presence calm but watchful. When my father entered the room, it was as though time slowed. Harold Delaney was still the same man, tall, broad-shouldered, with that unmistakable military posture. But there was something different in his eyes. He looked older, wearier, as if the weight of the past weeks had finally caught up with him. He didn't look at me as he took his seat. He kept his gaze on the panel, his hands folded in front of him, like he was preparing for battle. The chairwoman cleared her throat. Colonel Delaney, we've reviewed the evidence presented by Ms. Quinn Delaney. We'd like to hear your response. The silence stretched. My father's jaw tightened. Then, in a voice that was lower and rougher than I'd ever heard, he said, I authorized transfers I didn't vet. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had prepared myself for excuses for denial, but hearing him admit it so plainly made my breath catch. He continued, his tone steady but heavy. I trusted the wrong people. I signed off on agreements without fully reviewing the consequences. I let Miles and our legal advisors handle details I should have scrutinized myself. That's on me. I felt an unexpected ache in my chest, not just anger, but a strange mix of sorrow and relief. This was the man who had always prided himself on control, on being right, and now he was confessing in front of everyone. One of the investigators leaned forward. Colonel, are you acknowledging that these transfers violated the original terms of the trust? Yes, my father said without hesitation. I am. I glanced at him then, and for the first time he looked my way. Our eyes met, and in that brief moment I saw more than guilt. I saw regret, maybe even an unspoken apology. The panel began discussing legal consequences, potential restitution, and measures to freeze remaining funds. Through it all, my father stayed quiet, his gaze fixed on the table. When they asked if he had anything else to add, he looked up and said, My daughter uncovered the truth. She did what I should have done. The room went silent. I felt my throat tighten. Evelyn touched my arm, a subtle gesture of support. You don't have to say anything, she whispered. But I wanted to. I didn't come here to destroy my father. I said, my voice soft but steady. I came here to protect my mother's legacy. If telling the truth feels like betrayal, then maybe we need to ask ourselves what loyalty really means. The chairwoman nodded. Your testimony and your translations have been critical in exposing this scheme, Ms. Delaney. We will issue our findings shortly. As the hearing adjourned, my father remained seated. I walked past him slowly, not sure if I should stop or keep going. He didn't speak, but as I passed, he whispered just loud enough for me to hear, You did the right thing, Quinn. Those words stayed with me as I left the building. They weren't an apology, not fully, but they were something. Maybe the closest he could come to admitting he was proud of me. Outside, the winter air felt sharp and clean. I breathed it in, feeling a mix of exhaustion and clarity. This wasn't the end. There would still be consequences, still battles to fight. But for the first time, I felt like the truth had a chance to stand on its own. After the second hearing, I felt a strange quiet settle over my life. It wasn't the silence of defeat, nor was it triumph. It was the silence of clarity, the kind that follows a storm once the skies finally clear. I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life chasing shadows of financial wars or courtroom victories. I wanted to create something meaningful, something that could prevent others from enduring what I had just survived. That was when the idea for the listening lab took shape. It wasn't a traditional classroom or a legal clinic. It was a place where language law and life intersected. I wanted to teach people how to see through the fine print, how to understand the contracts that trap them, and how to recognize deception even when it's dressed in polished legal terms. The first day I opened the doors, I felt nervous but determined. The space was simple white walls, a large wooden table, and a wall of maps and charts showing different legal systems across the world. On the far wall, I pinned a single phrase, written in 9 languages. Truth is a language of its own. I started small with just a handful of students. Single mothers who had been swindled by shady financial schemes. Young entrepreneurs who had signed contracts they didn't fully understand. And retirees who had lost savings to offshore traps. Each of them carried stories that mirrored my own pain in some way. We began with the basics, learning how to read a contract, spotting irregularities, and identifying loopholes. But I also taught them something deeper, how to listen. Not just to words, but to tone pauses and the unspoken messages buried in language. I told them, listening isn't passive. It's an act of power. It's how you hear the truth hiding between the lines. With every lesson, I saw their eyes open wider. Some brought their own documents to class, asking me to walk them through the jargon. Others wanted to learn foreign terms, realizing that deception often hides across borders. I used my 9 languages not to impress, but to give them tools they could use to protect themselves. One evening, after a long session, an older woman approached me. Her voice trembled as she said, "Quinn, I wish I had known someone like you years ago. Maybe I wouldn't have lost everything." I looked into her eyes and felt the weight of why I was doing this. I smiled softly and said, "You haven't lost everything. You're here. You're learning. That means you're already stronger than before." The listening lab quickly became more than just a classroom. It became a sanctuary for those who had been silenced or deceived. And for me, it became a place of healing. Every time I taught someone how to decode a phrase or detect a lie, I felt like I was restoring a piece of my mother's legacy. I no longer felt the need to chase validation from my father or my brother. I was standing in my own space, building something from the ground up, not with money or power, but with knowledge and empathy. And that I realized was far more valuable than anything the trust fund could have given me. A month after I launched the listening lab, a small package arrived at my door. It was unmarked with no return address, but I knew instantly who it was from. My father's handwriting was unmistakable, tight, deliberate strokes, just like his signature on all those contracts I had exposed. Inside was a single photograph. It was me at 10 years old, sitting on the living room floor with an Italian cassette in my lap, headphones too big for my head, smiling like the whole world was open to me. Beneath the photo was a folded note. I unfolded it with shaking hands and read the words typed in his clipped formal style. "You once said intelligence changes worlds. Maybe you did." I stood there for a long time holding the photo and the note. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was something I had waited for all my life, an acknowledgement. He saw me. Maybe for the first time he truly saw me. I placed the photo on my desk next to my mother's old journal. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger or triumph. What I felt was a quiet certainty. I didn't need his apology anymore. I didn't need anyone's approval. What I needed was to keep standing tall, to keep teaching, to keep living with the knowledge that I had turned pain into purpose. Yeah, looking back, I understood something I hadn't before. Forgiveness wasn't about pretending the betrayal never happened. It was about refusing to let it define me. I had fought my way through lies and silence, and I had emerged stronger not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to honor the truth. Now when I walk into the listening lab, I see more than students. I see survivors just like me. I see people learning to stand their ground to fight back with clarity and intelligence. And in every class, I hear echoes of my mother's voice telling me, "This is how you change the world, one word, one truth at a time." Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.